A woman stands motionless in a barracks doorway, staring at a tray. White rice, real butter, fresh bread, her hands shake. December 1945, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. 247 Japanese women just learned their first lesson about America. This is the story of how simple acts of humanity broke what torture never could, and why returning home became their real punishment. November 12, 1945, the Pacific Ocean, 800 miles west of San Francisco. Nakamura Keiko pressed her forehead against the cold steel bulkhead of the USS General M.C. Meigs and tried to remember the prayer for honorable death. The words wouldn't come. 7 weeks of dysentery had hollowed her out, not just her body, but the place where certainty used to live. Through the porthole, she could see nothing but gray water and gray sky bleeding into each other. Somewhere in that grayness lay America. The word itself tasted like metal in her mouth. She wasn't supposed to be alive. None of them were. The 247 women crammed into the ship's forward hold represented an administrative inconvenience, a footnote to the war's massive prisoner exchanges. They'd been captured in the Philippines, nurses, clerical workers, comfort station managers, a handful of teachers who'd followed the Imperial Army to bring culture to the conquered territories. For 18 months, they'd been held in a makeshift compound in Manila, waiting for the Americans to remember they existed, waiting for orders that never came, waiting to die with dignity, as they'd been taught. Keiko was 26 years old. She had a teaching certificate from Tokyo Women's Normal School and 3 years' experience instructing Filipino children in proper Japanese. She had also spent the last year and a half learning to eat weevils without gagging and to ignore the sounds of women crying in the night. She'd learned other things, too: how to make a rope from bed sheets, where to find the sharpest edges in a bamboo barracks, which guards looked away when you positioned yourself near the perimeter fence at dawn. But the Americans had been meticulous about removing such opportunities. They'd put the women on a ship instead, this vast floating prison that smelled of diesel fuel and disinfectant. And now, after 3 weeks at sea, they were almost there. America. The belly of the beast. Nakamura-san. Keiko turned. Yamada Fumiko stood behind her, one hand pressed against the bulkhead for balance. Fumiko had been a nurse at the Imperial Army's 14th Field Hospital. She'd watched her entire ward burn when the Americans bombed Manila. She'd pulled 17 patients from the flames before the roof collapsed. 12 of them died anyway. "They're gathering us on deck," Fumiko said. Her voice was steady, professional, the voice of someone who'd long ago used up her capacity for fear. "The Americans say we can see the coast." "Why would we want to?" Fumiko's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "They seem to think we'd be interested." Up on deck, the wind cut like a blade. November in the North Pacific. Keiko pulled her thin cotton jacket tighter and immediately regretted it. The gesture revealed how loose it had become, how her body had consumed itself during the voyage. Around her, 246 other women shuffled into formation, their faces blank, their eyes tracking the American sailors who watched them from the rails. The sailors looked young, too young, and they weren't pointing weapons. That was the first discordant note. Keiko had expected guns, bayonets. The ritual of surrender required witnesses with weapons. But these boys, and they were boys, she could see that now, with their smooth cheeks and uncertain postures, just stood there, hands in pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold. One of them was eating an apple. Keiko watched him bite into it, watched the juice run down his chin, watched him wipe it carelessly with his sleeve. The apple was red and perfect, and impossibly large. Where did they get apples like that? How could a country at war have apples like that? There, Fumiko's voice, quiet beside her. On the horizon, a dark line resolved itself into land. America. The word had always been abstract to Keiko, a concept from geography lessons, a distant threat from propaganda films, the source of the demons who dropped fire from the sky. Now it was becoming real, emerging from the fog like something surfacing from deep water. San Francisco. The name meant nothing to Keiko except as a map coordinate. She'd never imagined she would see it. She'd never imagined surviving long enough to see anything. The ship's horn bellowed so loud it rattled in Keiko's chest. Around her, several women flinched. One started crying, soft, hopeless sounds that no one acknowledged. They'd all learned to ignore crying. It was like ignoring hunger or cold, or the constant ache of not knowing whether your family was alive. An American officer approached their group. He was older than the sailors, maybe 40, with gray at his temples and the weathered look of someone who'd spent too many years at sea. He stopped 3 meters away and waited until a Japanese-American translator hurried to his side. "Ladies," the translator's Japanese was fluent but oddly accented, shaped by American vowels. "Lieutenant Commander Harrison welcomes you to the United States. You'll disembark in approximately 2 hours. Please gather your personal belongings and prepare for transfer to shore facilities." Personal belongings. Keiko wanted to laugh. She owned the clothes she was wearing, a broken comb and a hand-drawn map of her neighborhood in Tokyo that she'd sketched from memory to keep herself sane. That was it. That was what she'd carry off this ship into enemy territory. "You'll be provided with food and medical care," the translator continued. "The United States government is committed to treating all prisoners of war in accordance with international law." International law. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Around Keiko, she could feel the other women processing it, turning it over, testing it against everything they'd been taught. International law hadn't helped when Tokyo burned. It hadn't helped in Manila or Okinawa or any of the places where Japanese civilians had been turned to ash. Why would it help now? "One more thing," the translator said. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Lieutenant Commander Harrison wants you to know that you'll be treated with respect. That's a direct order to all personnel. Anyone who violates that order will face court-martial." The translator turned to Harrison, said something in English. Harrison nodded, then did something that made Keiko's breath catch. He bowed, not deeply, not with the formal precision of a Japanese bow, but unmistakably, deliberately. He dipped his head and shoulders, holding the position for 3 seconds before straightening. No one moved. No one spoke. The wind screamed through the rigging, and the ship rolled beneath them, and 247 women stood frozen, trying to understand what they'd just witnessed. An American officer, bowing to prisoners, to women, to the enemy. The first crack appeared in Keiko's certainty, so small she almost didn't feel it. December 3, 1945, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Temperature 14 degrees. The cold was biblical, Old Testament cold, the kind that made your lungs ache with each breath and turned exposed skin gray within minutes. Keiko had never experienced anything like it. Tokyo got cold in winter, but nothing like this vast, hostile emptiness of frozen air. The barracks at Camp McCoy had been built for summer training exercises, not for housing people through a Wisconsin winter. Single-pane windows, gaps in the floorboards wide enough to see through. Heating came from 2 coal stoves per building, and the coal ration was barely enough to keep the temperature above freezing. "They're trying to kill us slowly," Tanaka Yoshiko muttered, pulling her blanket tighter. "This is their revenge." Keiko didn't answer. She was too busy watching the thermometer nailed to the barracks wall. It read 38 degrees Celsius inside. But here was the thing that didn't make sense. Every woman had been issued 3 wool blankets. Heavy ones. Army issue. The kind that actually trapped heat. They'd also been given winter coats. Thick, padded things with hoods and zippers that worked. Gloves, scarves, wool socks. The Americans were trying to keep them warm, not comfortable, not happy, but alive and functional. Why? Keiko had spent 3 weeks trying to answer that question. 3 weeks watching the Americans, studying their routines, searching for the trap that had to be waiting. Because there was always a trap. She'd learned that in Manila, when the military police had promised safe evacuation and then herded everyone into detention camps. She'd learned it in the ship's hold, when they'd said the voyage would be comfortable and then packed them in like cargo. But Camp McCoy kept refusing to reveal its trap. The food came 3 times a day. Not good food, Army rations mostly, with some kind of mystery meat that the Americans called spam, and watery vegetables from industrial cans. But there was enough of it, more than enough. Women who'd been walking skeletons in Manila started to fill out, their cheeks rounding, their eyes losing that hollow, predatory look. Keiko watched her own body betray her. Her ribs stopped showing. Her periods returned. Her hair stopped falling out in clumps when she combed it. She felt her body coming back to life, and it made her furious. Medical care was mandatory. Every woman underwent a physical examination within 48 hours of arrival. Keiko had been terrified. The propaganda about American medical experiments had been specific, detailed, impossible to forget. But the doctor who examined her was a woman named Captain Chen, Chinese-American, mid-30s, with hands that moved efficiently but never roughly. "Your left ankle," Chen said in Japanese that was better than the translators. "When did you injure it?" "Manila, 18 months ago." "It's healed badly. You're walking with a limp." "Yes." Chen made notes on her clipboard. "We'll need to re-break it and set it properly. Otherwise, you'll have chronic pain and mobility problems." Keiko stared at her. "You want to break my ankle?" "I want to fix it." Chen looked up, her expression unreadable. "It's your choice. But if you don't do it now, you'll regret it in 10 years. "I won't live 10 years. "Maybe not." Chen's voice was matter-of-fact. "But if you do, you'll want to be able to walk." And if that moment shattered your view of reality, proving that even enemies could show such shocking care, don't forget to hit that like button. It shows that these forgotten stories matter. Now, back to the moment that changed everything. December 15, 1945. Keiko sat on her bunk, staring at the small yellow pencil stub and 3 sheets of paper that had appeared during her barracks shift. She'd been out for 2 hours, working in the mess hall peeling potatoes. When she returned, they were there, placed carefully on her pillow like a gift. She looked around. No one met her eyes. Everyone was suddenly very interested in their own tasks, folding blankets, organizing their footlockers, staring at the ceiling. 3 days ago, she'd been caught scratching characters into the frost on the barracks window. Just practice, keeping her hand steady, maintaining the muscle memory of writing. The guard who'd seen her, a young corporal named Davis, had watched for a moment, then moved on without comment. Now this. Keiko picked up the pencil. It was short, barely 3 inches, worn down from use. Someone had sharpened it recently. The tip was perfect, clean. The paper was the same lined notebook paper the Americans used, slightly yellowed, wrinkled at the edges. It was nothing. Trash, practically. A pencil stub someone would throw away. It was also the first gift anyone had given her in 2 years. Her hands shook as she smoothed the paper flat. She should refuse it. She should throw it away. She should maintain discipline, remember who she was. Remember that accepting kindness from the enemy was a form of collaboration. Instead, she began to write. First, her name in kanji, the characters flowing from muscle memory deeper than thought. Then, her mother's name. Her father's. Her younger brother Takeshi, who'd been 14 the last time she saw him, all awkward limbs and adolescent pride in his cadet uniform. The characters looked strange on the lined American paper. Too dense, too dark, too Japanese for this foreign space. But they were hers, and seeing them made something loosen in her chest, something that had been wound tight since Manila, since the ship, since she'd stopped believing she had the right to think of herself as human. "Nakamura-san." Keiko looked up, frantically shoving the paper under her blanket. But it was just Fumiko, standing at the foot of her bunk with an expression Keiko couldn't read. "The guard is asking for you." Keiko's stomach dropped. Of course. The pencil had been a trap after all. Bait to catch her in the act of... what? Writing? Being Japanese? Existing? Which guard? Davis, the young one. Keiko forced herself to stand, forced her face into blankness. She followed Fumiko out of the barracks into the crystalline cold of a Wisconsin afternoon. Davis was waiting by the door, his breath making clouds in the frozen air. He looked nervous. That was wrong. Guards didn't get nervous. Prisoners got nervous. This reversal of expectations made Keiko's skin prickle with unease. Davis cleared his throat. "Ma'am." He'd started calling her that after the first week. Not prisoner, not enemy, just ma'am, like she was a person with status, with dignity. "The CO wants to see you. About your ankle." "My ankle?" "The surgery. Captain Chen says you agreed to it." Keiko hadn't agreed to anything. She'd simply stopped refusing. There was a difference, but the Americans didn't seem to understand it. The camp hospital was a converted barracks with real heating. Keiko felt the warmth hit her face as she stepped through the door. Not the barely adequate warmth of the coal stoves, but actual generous heat that soaked into her bones. Captain Chen was waiting in one of the examination rooms. She gestured to a chair. "Sit." Keiko sat. "I can do the surgery tomorrow," Chen said without preamble, "but I want you to understand what's involved. I'll need to re-break the ankle at the original fracture site, then set it properly with pins. You'll be in a cast for 6 weeks. After that, physical therapy. Probably another 2 months before you're walking normally." "Why?" The question surprised both of them. Chen blinked. "Because your ankle is—" "No." Keiko kept her voice flat. "Why do you care? Why does any of this matter? We're prisoners. We're the enemy. In 6 months or a year, you'll send us back to Japan, and none of this will matter." Chen set down her clipboard. For a long moment, she just looked at Keiko, not with the clinical assessment of a doctor, but with something more complicated, something almost like recognition. "You want the truth?" Chen said finally. "Yes." "Because I'm a doctor." Chen's voice was steady, factual. "And you're my patient. That's not complicated. It doesn't require me to like you or approve of your country's actions. It doesn't even require you to want to be healed. I took an oath. The oath doesn't have exceptions for enemies." "But we are enemies." "Yes." Chen didn't look away. "My grandparents died in Nanking. Did you know that? December 1937. My grandmother was 63. My grandfather was 67. They ran a pharmacy. It took them 3 days to die." The words landed like stones. Keiko felt something cold slide down her spine. "So yes," Chen continued, her voice still steady, still professional, "we're enemies. And I'm still going to fix your ankle, because that's what doctors do. We fix people. It's not conditional. It's not dependent on whether you deserve it. It's not even dependent on whether you want it. It's what we do." She picked up her clipboard again. "Surgery is scheduled for Zola 800 tomorrow. Don't eat or drink anything after midnight tonight. Questions?" Keiko's throat was too tight to speak. She shook her head. "Good. Davis will take you back to your barracks." But as Keiko reached the door, Chen spoke again. "Nakamura-san." Keiko turned. "The pencil." Chen's expression was unreadable. "Everyone needs to write. Everyone needs to remember they're more than just a number in a camp. I can't make policy, but I can ignore what I don't see. Understand?" Keiko understood. She understood that Captain Chen had just given her permission to be human, and she understood that this permission was more terrifying than any torture could have been. December 16th, 1945. Soto 800 hours. The operating room was the brightest place Keiko had ever been. White walls, white sheets, white light streaming from fixtures that hummed with electricity. Even the cold was different here. Clinical, controlled, nothing like the wild cold outside. "You'll feel a pinch," the anesthesiologist said through the translator. "Then you'll count backward from 10. Keiko counted 10, 9, 8. The world went soft at the edges. 7, 6. She thought about her mother's hands folding paper cranes. 5. She thought about the smell of rice cooking in the morning. 4. She thought about Takeshi asking why the sky was blue. 3. The world disappeared. When she woke, the pain was enormous, not sharp but deep, throbbing in waves that started in her ankle and radiated up her leg into her spine. She tried to speak and produced only a dry croak. "Easy." Chen's voice close by. "The anesthesia needs to wear off. Don't try to move." Keiko's vision cleared slowly. She was in a recovery room, small, dim, warm. Chen sat beside the bed, making notes on a chart. Her hair was pulled back severely, and there were dark circles under her eyes. "How long?" Keiko managed. 3 hours. The break was worse than I thought. Had to use more pins than planned." Chen set down her chart. "You'll have a nice scar." "Does it matter?" "Scars always matter." Chen's voice was thoughtful. "They're proof you survived something." Keiko closed her eyes. The pain was clarifying in a strange way. It cut through the fog of the anesthesia and forced her into the present moment. She was alive. She was in an American military hospital. A Chinese-American doctor had just spent 3 hours reconstructing her ankle with what Keiko now understood were precious medical resources: antibiotics, anesthesia, surgical steel. Why? The question came out before Keiko could stop it. Why waste all this on me? Chen was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was careful, precise. "Do you know what they taught us in medical school? The first principle of medicine, primum non nocere. First, do no harm. Not first do no harm unless the patient is your enemy. Not first do no harm unless your grandparents were massacred. Just do no harm." She leaned forward, and Keiko saw something raw in her expression, something unguarded. "I spent 2 years trying to decide whether I was betraying my family by treating Japanese prisoners with dignity," Chen said. 2 years asking myself if my grandparents would understand. And you know what I realized? They would understand better than anyone, because they knew that humanity isn't something you can choose to turn off. Once you start making exceptions, this person doesn't deserve compassion, that person doesn't deserve care, you've already lost the thing that makes you human. She stood, checking the monitors beside Keiko's bed. "So I fix your ankle. Not because you deserve it, not because I've forgiven what Japan did, but because if I don't, if I let hatred determine who receives care, then I become something I can't live with. And my grandparents didn't die so I could become that." Chen paused at the door. "There's a choice in every action. I chose to be a doctor. That means something. Even here. Even now. Especially now." The door closed behind her with a soft click. Keiko lay in the dim room, feeling the throb of her newly broken, newly healed ankle, and tried to understand what had just happened. Chen had given her a gift more devastating than any punishment could be. She'd treated her like a person, not a Japanese person, not an enemy, just a person who needed help. And in doing so, she'd destroyed the wall Keiko had been building since Manila, the wall that said Americans were demons, that said suffering at their hands was inevitable, that said maintaining hatred was a form of patriotism. The wall cracked, piece by piece, brick by brick. What was underneath was terrifying. It was the possibility that everything she'd been taught was wrong. January 1946. The letters started arriving in late December, but the camp administration held them until after New Year's, some policy about maintaining order during the holidays. When they finally distributed them, Keiko's name was called along with 198 others. She held the envelope in both hands, afraid to open it. The return address was written in her mother's careful script: Tokyo, Shinjuku Ward. The paper was thin, cheap, the kind you could see through if you held it to the light. She opened it. "My dear Keiko, we received word that you are alive. Your father cried for the first time since we learned of the surrender. We had believed you dead. There was no news from the Philippines, no prisoner lists, nothing but silence. I want to tell you that we are well, but I cannot lie to my daughter. Tokyo is ashes. Our neighborhood burned in the March raids. We live now with your aunt in Setagaya, 14 people in 2 rooms. The roof leaks. There is never enough food. Takeshi is alive, but very thin. He eats bark from the trees to ease his hunger. Last week he found a dead cat and brought it home. We made soup. I am ashamed to tell you this, but it is the truth. Your father trades his war medals for rice on the black market. His hands shake from hunger. Yesterday he fainted at the factory. They say he cannot work unless he eats more, but there is nothing to eat. I tell you these things not to burden you, but so you will know what has become of us. We endure. We survive. We wait for your return, though I do not know when that will be, or what Japan you will find. Please eat, Keiko. Please stay alive. That is all a mother can ask. With love, your mother Keiko read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her footlocker beneath the 3 sheets of paper where she'd been practicing her kanji. That night, dinner was pork chops, actual meat, cooked until tender, served with mashed potatoes and canned green beans. The portions were generous. There was butter. There was bread. There was enough. There was always enough. Keiko looked down at her plate and felt her throat close. She thought about Takeshi eating bark. She thought about her father's shaking hands. She thought about 14 people in 2 rooms with a leaking roof. She thought about herself, warm, fed, with a cast on her ankle, and antibiotics in her system, and a real bed to sleep in. The shame was crushing. Around her she could see other women having similar realizations. Yamada Fumiko sat frozen, staring at her plate like it was a crime scene. Tanaka Yoshiko had pushed her food away and was crying silently, tears running down her face and dripping onto the table. Someone started to laugh, a high hysterical sound that bordered on screaming. A guard moved toward her, concerned, but she waved him off and kept laughing, kept breaking apart. Keiko forced herself to eat. Every bite felt like betrayal. Every swallow was an act of treason. But she ate anyway, because her mother had asked her to, because her body demanded it, because refusing to eat wouldn't help Takeshi or her father or anyone else. That was the moment for many of them. Not the surgery or the blankets or the pencils. This, the realization that they were living better as prisoners of war than their families were living as free citizens of Japan. The letters kept coming, each one worse than the last. My daughter is dead. Diphtheria. She was 7 years old. Father has tuberculosis. The hospital has no medicine. We are surviving on 200 grams of rice per day. The children cry constantly from hunger. Your brother volunteered for the Special Attack Corps. We have not heard from him since August. I believe he is dead. One woman received a letter informing her that her entire family had been in Hiroshima on August 6th. There were no remains, no graves, just a shadow on a wall where a human being used to be. She read the letter once. Then she walked calmly to her bunk, lay down, and stopped speaking. She didn't speak again for 3 months. The Americans didn't punish her. They just made sure she kept eating. March 1946. Keiko's cast came off on a Tuesday. The ankle was stiff, weak, the skin pale and strange-looking from weeks of confinement. But when she stood and put weight on it, there was no pain. Just a dull ache that Chen promised would fade with time. You'll need to do exercises, Chen explained, demonstrating. 15 minutes, 3 times a day. It'll hurt at first. Do it anyway. I understand, Chen hesitated. How are you doing? Really? I'm alive. That's not what I asked. Keiko looked at her ankle. The scar was thick, pink, obvious. Proof that she'd survived something. Proof that an enemy had cared whether she could walk properly. I don't know what I am anymore, Keiko said slowly. I was taught that Americans were demons, that they would torture us, abuse us, treat us as less than human. But you gave me back my ankle. The guards gave me pencils. The cook makes sure we have enough to eat. And my family is starving. She looked up, meeting Chen's eyes. How do I go home to that? How do I face my brother and explain that I was eating pork chops while he was eating bark? How do I tell my mother that the demons treated me better than my own government ever did? Chen sat down heavily. I don't have an answer for that. I know. But I'll tell you what my grandmother used to say. Guilt is not a virtue. It's just another form of self-absorption. You're not responsible for where you were or what you were fed. You didn't choose to be captured. You didn't choose any of this, but I'm benefiting from it. You're surviving it. That's not the same thing. Chen's voice was firm. When you go home, and you will go home, you'll carry this experience with you. What you do with it, how you use it, whether you let it make you bitter or compassionate or wise, that's your choice. But you don't owe anyone your suffering. You don't have to starve to prove your loyalty. Want to hear more stories like this that official history forgot? Hit that subscribe button. Because what happened next to these women was even more devastating than captivity. Let's continue. June 15th, 1946, Port of Tokyo. The American transport ship General Stuart Heinzelman approached Tokyo Bay at dawn. Keiko stood at the rail with 246 other women, watching the coastline emerge from the morning haze. This should have been a moment of joy, liberation, homecoming, return to family and country and everything familiar. Instead, Keiko felt dread settling into her bones like ice. The port was rubble, not damaged, rubble. Mountains of broken concrete and twisted metal stretching as far as she could see. Here and there, a wall stood intact, windows like empty eyes staring at nothing. But mostly there was just destruction, systematic and complete. "Oh God," Fumiko breathed beside her. "What did they do?" "Everything. They'd done everything." The ship docked at a temporary pier. The original docks were underwater, destroyed in the same raids that had leveled the city. American MPs escorted them down the gangway in groups of 20, processing paperwork with efficient impersonality. Keiko stepped onto Japanese soil for the first time in 3 years. It felt like landing on an alien planet. The people looked wrong, too thin, too gray, moving with the slow deliberation of those who'd learned to conserve every calorie. Their clothes hung like rags. Their eyes were hollow. A Red Cross station had been set up in one of the few intact buildings. Keiko joined the line of people searching for family information, clutching her mother's letters like talismans. "Nakamura family," she told the volunteer, a middle-aged woman with a clipboard and the exhausted look of someone who'd been working without sleep. "Setagaya Ward." The woman flipped through her records. "Address?" Keiko gave her aunt's address. The woman made a note. "They're alive. Registered at the Setagaya Distribution Center. Your brother Takeshi is listed as deceased. Malnutrition, February 1946. The words took a moment to land. When they did, Keiko had to grip the table edge to stay standing. "How old?" Her voice came from somewhere distant. 16. I'm sorry." 16. Takeshi had been 16 years old. He'd died while Keiko was learning to walk again on her newly healed ankle, while she was eating 3 meals a day, while she was alive and warm and safe. "Thank you," Keiko heard herself say. "Where can I find them?" The volunteer gave her directions. Keiko walked away in a daze, Fumiko's hand on her elbow, guiding her through the ruined streets. Setagaya Ward was worse than the port. At least the port still functioned. Ships came and went. People worked. Setagaya was a graveyard. Block after block of burned foundations and collapsed buildings. Makeshift shelters made from sheet metal and salvaged wood. Cooking fires sending thin smoke into the gray sky. Keiko's aunt's house, or what was left of it, sat at the end of a street that no longer existed. 3 walls and half a roof. A tarp stretched across the missing section. 14 people living in 2 rooms. Her mother was drawing water from a communal well. She'd aged a decade in 3 years. Her hair was mostly gray now, her face lined, her hands roughened by work. She looked up as Keiko approached, and for a moment there was no recognition, just the blank assessment of a stranger. Then her eyes widened. "Keiko?" "Mother." They stood 5 feet apart, neither moving, because there was an impossible gulf between them now, the gulf between hunger and satiation, between suffering and mercy, between what had been endured and what had been given. Her mother's eyes traveled down Keiko's body, taking in the American military coat, The clean skin, the healthy weight, the sturdy shoes. Taking in evidence of care, of nourishment, of survival. "You're alive," her mother said. It wasn't quite an accusation, but it wasn't quite a welcome either. "Yes." "Takeshi is dead." "I know. They told me." Her mother nodded slowly. "He asked about you at the end. He wanted to know if the demons were feeding you well." She smiled, and it was the saddest thing Keiko had ever seen. "I told him no. I told him you were surely suffering, surely being treated terribly. I lied to him so he could die believing you shared his pain." The words hit like a physical blow. "Mother." "But I was wrong." Her mother's voice was steady, factual. "You weren't suffering, were you? They fed you. They kept you warm. They gave you medicine." She gestured to Keiko's ankle. "They even fixed your old injury. I can see you walking properly." "It wasn't, I'm not angry, Keiko." And that was the terrible truth. There was no anger in her mother's voice, just a flat, exhausted acceptance. "You survived. That's what matters. You survived while your brother starved. You survived while your father traded his war medals for moldy rice. You survived while Japan burned." She picked up her water bucket. "Come inside. Your father will want to see you, though I warn you, he's not the man you remember. None of us are." Keiko followed her mother into the ruined house. 14 people in 2 rooms, sleeping mats on the floor, a single cooking pot, clothes hung on a line to dry. Her father sat in the corner, wrapped in a thin blanket despite the June warmth. When he saw her, he tried to stand, failed, tried again. Fumiko moved to help him, but he waved her off with a trembling hand. "Daughter." His voice was a rasp. "You came home." "Yes, father." "Good. That's good." He studied her face, her clothes, her healthy complexion. Something flickered in his eyes. Not resentment, but something more complicated. Recognition, perhaps. Or loss. "Did they treat you well?" he asked. The question hung in the air. Everyone in the room had stopped what they were doing. 14 pairs of eyes fixed on Keiko, waiting. She could lie. She should lie. Tell them about hardship and deprivation, about cold barracks and cruel guards. Make her survival match their suffering, but she'd spent 6 months learning a different kind of truth. "Yes," she said quietly. "They treated me well." Her father closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet. "I'm glad," he whispered. "I'm glad one of us was treated like a human being." That night, Keiko lay on a borrowed mat in the crowded room and listened to the sounds of her family breathing. Her mother's slight wheeze, her father's rattling cough, her aunt's restless shifting, the children whimpering in their sleep. She thought about the barracks at Camp McCoy, the coal stoves, the wool blankets, the 3 meals a day, Captain Chen's steady hands, Davis leaving pencils on her bunk, the surgery that had given her back her ability to walk. She thought about the choice Chen had described, to be a doctor, to be human, to choose compassion even when hatred would be easier. And she understood finally what had broken her and the other 246 women. It wasn't cruelty. Cruelty they could have endured. Cruelty would have confirmed everything they'd been taught, would have validated their hatred, would have made their sacrifice meaningful. It was mercy that destroyed them. Mercy made them question everything, made them see their captors as human, made them recognize that their own government had seen them as expendable, while their enemies had seen them as worth saving. That was the real torture. Not physical pain, but the psychological agony of discovering that everything you'd believed was built on lies. July 1946. Keiko found work at a textile factory in Shinagawa. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, payment in rice rations rather than money. The factory had been hastily rebuilt after the firebombing, with sheet metal walls and a concrete floor that never got warm. She worked alongside 40 other women, most of them returnees like herself, former nurses, teachers, clerical workers. Women who'd survived the war only to discover that survival itself was a form of guilt. No one talked about where they'd been. It was an unspoken rule. You didn't ask, and you didn't tell, because the answer was always the same. They'd been somewhere better than here. But 3 weeks into the job, during the lunch break, one of the women, a former Army nurse named Sato, stood up suddenly and screamed, "I can't do this anymore." Everyone froze. "I can't pretend," Sato's voice cracked. "I can't pretend I don't remember. I spent 18 months in an American field hospital in Guam. Do you know what they gave us? 3 meals a day, real beds, medicine that actually worked. I gained 15 pounds. 15 pounds, while my sister was eating grass in Hiroshima." She pulled up her sleeve, revealing a faded scar. "I had appendicitis. They operated on me, gave me penicillin, saved my life. And when I came home, I found my sister's body in the ruins. She died of an infected cut on her leg. A cut! Something that could have been cured with the same antibiotics they wasted on me." Tears streamed down her face. "So tell me, how do I live with that? How do I wake up every morning and not hate myself for being alive?" No one answered, because there was no answer. One by one, other women started talking, sharing their stories, the guilt they carried, the shame of their health, the impossible burden of having been treated with dignity by an enemy while their families suffered. Tanaka Yoshiko, who'd been captured in Manila, described receiving a Christmas package from the American Red Cross: soap, toothpaste, chocolate, socks. She'd opened it and cried for 3 hours because her children were dead and she was receiving chocolate. Yamada Fumiko talked about the American doctor who treated her burns with such care, using precious supplies, working for hours to minimize scarring. "He called me ma'am," she said, her voice hollow, "even after I spit in his face. Even after I told him I hoped he died. He just cleaned up my spit and kept working, called me ma'am like I was someone who mattered." "And now?" someone asked. "Now I work 12 hours a day for a bowl of rice. Now I sleep on concrete. Now I watch people die of diseases that could be cured with medicine I know exists, medicine I've seen, medicine that was used on me." Fumiko's hand shook. "The Americans showed me what was possible. They showed me that suffering isn't inevitable, that people can be fed, can be warm, can be treated with dignity. And then they sent me back to this." "So what do we do?" someone whispered. Silence. Because what could they do? They couldn't unknow what they'd learned, couldn't unsee what they'd seen, couldn't go back to believing that this suffering was noble, necessary, part of some greater purpose. The Americans had given them something far more dangerous than comfort. They'd given them a vision of what life could be. And that vision made their present reality unbearable. September 1946. Keiko sat with her mother on the steps of the ruined house, watching the sunset turn the ruins of Tokyo orange and gold. Her father was inside, coughing. The tuberculosis was getting worse. They'd applied for medicine through the occupation authorities, but the waiting list was 6 months long. "There's something I need to tell you," Keiko said. Her mother didn't look at her. "About the Americans?" "Yes. I already know, Keiko. Every time you move, every time you eat, every time you speak, I can see it. You're different now. They changed you." "They didn't torture me, Mother. They should have. I expected them to. I was prepared for it. But instead," Keiko's voice broke, "instead they gave me blankets and food and medicine. They fixed my ankle. Not because they had to, but because they could. Because their doctor believed everyone deserved medical care, even enemies." She looked down at her hands. "A guard once left pencils on my bunk because he saw me trying to write in the frost. An anesthesiologist made sure I wasn't in pain during surgery. A cook always gave me extra rice because he said I looked thin. And you feel guilty for this? I feel like a traitor. I survived because the enemy chose to be merciful, while Takeshi died because our own government—" She couldn't finish. Her mother was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "You know what your brother said to me before he died?" He said he was glad he was Japanese, that he'd rather die Japanese than live as a slave to America. He believed that until the very end. It gave him dignity in his suffering. She turned to look at Keiko. But you've lost that, haven't you? You can't believe in that dignity anymore, because you've seen that suffering isn't noble, it's just suffering. That dying for the emperor isn't sacrifice, it's waste. The Americans showed you that, didn't they? Yes? So now you carry a different burden, not the burden of survival, but the burden of knowledge. You know what we could have been, what we could have chosen, and you have to live in a world that chose differently. Her mother reached out, took Keiko's hand. Her skin was rough, calloused, the hands of someone who'd worked too hard for too long. I'm not angry at you, my daughter. How could I be? You survived. But I am angry at what they did to you. They treated me well. No, her mother's voice was sharp. They showed you mercy when they should have shown you justice. If they'd been cruel, you could hate them. If they'd been brutal, you could maintain your pride. But they were kind. They were humane. And in doing so, they took away your ability to see this suffering as meaningful. She squeezed Keiko's hand. That's the real cruelty, don't you see? They broke you not with torture, but with compassion. They made you doubt everything you were taught. They made you question whether your brother's death meant anything at all. And now you have to live with that doubt for the rest of your life. Keiko felt tears on her face. I don't know how. None of us do, daughter. None of us do. November 1946. The first reunion of former Japanese women POWs was held in a community center in Ikebukuro, one of the few buildings that had survived the firebombing. 83 women came. The others were too ashamed, or too broken, or too dead. Keiko almost didn't go. What was the point? What could they possibly say to each other that would help? But Fumiko convinced her. We need to talk to people who understand, she said. People who don't look at us like we're traitors for being alive. The center was cold, drafty, lit by kerosene lamps. The women sat in a circle on the floor, wrapped in whatever coats and blankets they had. For the first 10 minutes, no one spoke. They just looked at each other, recognizing their own guilt, and confusion reflected back. Finally, an older woman, a former schoolteacher named Watanabe, broke the silence. I've been thinking about what we owe, she said. We were shown mercy when our families received none. We were fed when our children starved. We were treated like humans when our government treated us like expendable tools. So what do we owe? Do we owe our families an apology for surviving? Do we owe Japan loyalty despite its lies? Do we owe America gratitude for the mercy that broke us? We owe ourselves the truth, someone said. It was Sato, the nurse who'd broken down at the factory. The truth that we were lied to, that everything we were taught about the Americans was propaganda designed to make us willing to die, and now we have to decide what to do with that knowledge. What can we do? Another woman asked bitterly. We're nothing. Women. Returnees. Contaminated by contact with the enemy. We have no power, no voice, no future. We have our stories, Keiko heard herself say. Everyone turned to look at her. We have what we saw, what we experienced, the proof that there was another way, that suffering isn't inevitable, that enemies can choose mercy, that governments can lie to their own people. And what good does that do us now? Someone challenged. I don't know, Keiko admitted, but it's all we have, and maybe someday it will matter. Maybe our children or our grandchildren will ask us what the war was really like, and we can tell them the truth, not the heroic version, not the propaganda. The truth. Fumiko nodded slowly. The truth that we were prepared for torture, that we'd been taught Americans were demons who would abuse and kill us. And instead, she paused. Instead, they gave us blankets. And medicine, someone added. And pencils. And dignity. And in doing so, Watanabe finished, they took away our ability to hate them, which was the cruelest kindness of all. The women sat in silence, each processing their own version of this truth. Around them, Tokyo lay in ruins, a city destroyed by American bombs, occupied by American soldiers, dependent on American aid. A country that had chosen war and received devastation. And here they sat, 247 women who'd survived that war, only to discover that survival itself was a form of betrayal. So what do? Someone asked again. We live, Keiko said softly. We live with the knowledge. We carry it. We remember both versions, the propaganda and the reality. And when we're asked, we tell the truth, not because it will change anything, not because it will ease our guilt, but because someone has to remember what actually happened, even if no one wants to hear it, especially if no one wants to hear it. March 1952. Keiko stood at the entrance to Ueno Park, watching cherry blossoms drift like snow across the pathways. 6 years since her return. 6 years of factory work and survival, and slow, painful reconstruction, both of the city and of herself. She'd married the previous year, a widower named Tanaka, who'd lost his first wife in the Hiroshima bombing. He knew she was a returnee. He knew she'd been a prisoner. He'd never asked for details, and she'd never volunteered them. But last night their infant daughter had developed a fever. Keiko had rushed her to the new clinic, run by American occupation authorities, and watched as a young doctor examined her with careful professional attention. He'd prescribed antibiotics, modern medicine, the kind that could save lives. And Keiko had stood there, holding her crying daughter, and thought about Captain Chen, about the choice to be a doctor, about the commitment to heal regardless of politics or nationality or hate. Mrs. Tanaka, she turned. Fumiko stood behind her, older now, her hair streaked with gray. They'd stayed in contact sporadically, letters every few months, brief meetings when their schedules allowed. Fumiko-san, it's good to see you. And you. Fumiko smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I heard about your daughter. Is she better? Yes. The antibiotics worked quickly. Good, that's good. Fumiko looked out at the cherry blossoms. I got a letter last week. From Chen. Captain Chen, I mean. She's practicing in San Francisco now. She wanted to know how we were all doing, whether we'd found peace. Have we? No. Fumiko's answer was immediate. But I'm learning to live with the lack of it, to carry the contradiction, grateful for mercy I didn't deserve, guilty for receiving what my family never got, angry at the circumstances that created this impossible situation. Keiko nodded. I think that's all we can do. Carry it. Remember it. Refuse to let either version, the propaganda or the reality, be forgotten. Do you ever regret it? Fumiko asked. Surviving, I mean. Living with this knowledge? Keiko thought about her daughter's healthy smile this morning, about her husband's quiet kindness, about the slow rebuilding of her life from ruins. No, she said finally. I don't regret surviving, but I'll never stop feeling the weight of it, the weight of being shown mercy when mercy was supposed to be impossible, the weight of learning that enemies could be human, that governments could lie, that everything we'd been taught was designed to make us willing to die for nothing. She looked at Fumiko. Captain Chen was right, you know, in choosing to be a doctor, in choosing to heal even when it would have been easier to hate. She gave me something more valuable than medicine. She gave me proof that people can choose compassion over vengeance, and that choice matters, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Do you think we'll ever stop feeling guilty? No, Keiko said honestly. I think we'll carry this until we die. The guilt of survival, the shame of being fed while others starved, the impossible burden of knowing that our enemies treated us better than our own government did. She paused, watching the cherry blossoms swirl in the wind. But maybe that's our purpose, to be the living proof that war doesn't have to destroy humanity, that even in the midst of violence and hatred, people can choose mercy, and that those choices echo forward, shaping the future in ways we can't yet understand. Heavy burden, Fumiko said softly. Yes, Keiko agreed, but someone has to carry it. They stood together in the spring sunshine, two women who'd been prepared for torture but received kindness, who'd expected brutality but found dignity, who'd survived a war only to discover that survival itself was the real test. Behind them, Tokyo continued its slow resurrection. New buildings rising from old ashes, new lives built on old ruins, new choices emerging from old mistakes. And somewhere in that future, perhaps their story would matter. Perhaps someone would ask what really happened to those 247 women. Perhaps someone would want to know the truth, not the comfortable version, not the propaganda, but the complex, contradictory, impossible truth. That they were broken not by torture, but by mercy. That they were defeated not by cruelty, but by compassion. That they learned the hardest lesson of all, that enemies can be human, that humanity transcends nationality, and that recognizing this truth means carrying its weight forever. The cherry blossoms continued to fall, each petal a small, beautiful reminder that even after devastation, life finds a way to bloom again. And Keiko, standing in the ruins of her old certainties, holding tight to the new truths she'd learned, understood that this was her war to fight now, not with weapons or hatred or propaganda, but with memory, honesty, and the refusal to let either version of history, the comfortable lie or the uncomfortable truth, be forgotten. That was her burden. That was her choice. And like Captain Chen before her, she would carry it with dignity, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt.